I never thought a simple children's safety sign would start a chain reaction that ended with an HOA president losing her position, a neighborhood facing lawsuits, and thousands of dollars changing hands. But that's exactly what happened. My name is Robert Keller. I'm 58 years old, retired from the commercial electrical business. And for most of my life, I believed in one simple rule: if people treat you with respect, you return that respect tenfold. The problem is that some people eventually mistake kindness for weakness. And once that happens, they start believing your property is their property, your patience is their entitlement, and your silence is their permission. That was the mistake the Cedar Brook Estates HOA made. For almost a decade, I owned a narrow private access road running across a section of my land in northern Alabama. It wasn't a huge road, nothing fancy, just a short stretch of pavement that connected the backside of a large gated subdivision to the main county highway. For years, residents used it every day. Delivery trucks used it. Contractors used it. Emergency vehicles used it. Technically, they weren't supposed to, because there was never a recorded easement, never a signed agreement, never a dollar paid for access. But I let it happen because, honestly, it wasn't hurting anybody. My grandkids came over every weekend, they rode bicycles, chased each other around the driveway, and played basketball near that road. Because of that, I installed a bright yellow sign that said "Children playing slow down." Nothing political, nothing controversial, just common sense. Most drivers respected it. Some even waved at the kids. Life was peaceful until the HOA elected a new president named Melissa Hart. Now, if you've ever lived around somebody who enjoys authority a little too much, you know the type. Every conversation sounds like an order. Every disagreement feels like a challenge to their ego. Melissa wasn't satisfied managing neighborhood, landscaping, or pool rules. She wanted control over everything she could see. One afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a certified letter from the HOA. At first, I thought it had been delivered by mistake because I wasn't even part of the community. Then I read it. According to the letter, my children's safety sign did not conform to community aesthetic standards and needed to be removed within 5 business days. I actually laughed out loud when I read it. I thought it was a joke. Then I realized they were serious. So I called Melissa. I explained politely that the sign sat entirely on my private property. I explained that my grandchildren used that area regularly. I explained that the road itself belonged to me. There was a long pause before she answered. Then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Your property may technically be outside the HOA, but it affects our community image." Community image. Imagine telling a grandfather that protecting children hurts curb appeal. I tried reasoning with her. That was my mistake. People like Melissa don't hear explanations. They hear resistance. The more calmly I spoke, the more irritated she became. Finally, she said, "We're giving you 5 days to cooperate." Cooperate. As if she was granting me permission to use my own land. 3 days later, I walked outside carrying a cup of coffee and immediately noticed something missing. The sign was gone. At first, I thought maybe a storm knocked it down. Then I found it. Somebody had pulled it out of the ground and tossed it inside my trash bin near the garage. That's the moment everything changed. Until then, this was a disagreement. After that, it became trespassing. Somebody acting on behalf of the HOA had entered my property, removed my sign, and disposed of it like garbage. I stood there staring at that bent metal sign, and I'll be honest, I wasn't angry right away. I was disappointed. For 9 years, I'd allowed that neighborhood to benefit from my goodwill. For 9 years, I never demanded a dime. For 9 years, I had treated them like neighbors, even though I had absolutely no obligation to do so. And somehow they convinced themselves they had authority over me. That afternoon, I walked into my home office and opened a filing cabinet that hadn't been touched in years. If Melissa wanted to make this about property rights, I was going to make sure we used actual property rights. I pulled out my original deed. Then I requested updated survey records from the county. Then I started digging through old correspondence. What I found changed everything. Buried inside an email chain from several years earlier was a message from Melissa herself thanking me for allowing temporary access until a formal easement could eventually be negotiated. Temporary access. Those 2 words jumped off the page, because that single email proved she knew exactly who owned the road. She knew the HOA had no permanent rights. She knew every vehicle crossing that pavement was doing so because I allowed it. And despite knowing all that, she still decided she could order me around on my own property. Sitting there in my office, looking at that email on my computer screen, I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking, well, Melissa, you just made this very easy. She believed the road belonged to the neighborhood because they had used it for years. She believed I would continue being accommodating because I always had been. She believed removing a grandfather's safety sign would embarrass me into compliance. Instead, she had just handed me the evidence I needed to remind everyone exactly where that road was located and exactly who owned every inch of it. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me pause for a second because this is where a lot of people misunderstand situations like this. Folks hear HOA stories and immediately assume the loudest person must be right, especially when they're waving around official-looking letters and talking about rules. But according to standard procedure, an HOA only has authority over properties that are actually subject to its governing documents. If your land isn't part of the association, their power doesn't magically extend across a property line just because they don't like something. From a legal perspective, that's where Melissa made her first major mistake. She confused convenience with ownership. The neighborhood had been using my road for years, so in her mind, access started feeling permanent even though no legal agreement existed. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere in life. People become accustomed to a benefit, then slowly stop viewing it as a privilege and start viewing it as a right. Once that happens, gratitude disappears and entitlement takes its place. The lesson here is simple generosity without boundaries often creates expectations instead of appreciation. And trust me, that lesson was about to become very expensive for the HOA. The morning after I found that email, I stopped debating whether I should do something and started figuring out exactly how I was going to do it. The county survey arrived first. The surveyor couldn't have made it any clearer if he'd painted the property lines in neon lights. The entire access road sat on my land from one end to the other. Not part of it, not most of it, every single inch. A few days later, I met with my attorney, laid the survey on his desk, showed him the deed, then slid Melissa's email across the table. He read it twice, leaned back, smiled, and said, well, this changes everything. That was the first time I realized just how badly the HOA had miscalculated. They thought they were enforcing authority. In reality, they were exposing themselves. Within 2 weeks, I hired a contractor and installed a heavy steel security gate across the entrance to the road. Not some cheap chain link setup either. This thing looked like it belonged at a commercial facility. Electronic access controls, backup power, remote monitoring, 2 high-definition cameras covering every angle. When the installation was complete, I sent a certified package to the HOA office. Inside were copies of the deed, the survey, Melissa's email, and a formal notice informing them that all access privileges were terminated immediately. No threats, no emotional language, just facts. The gate closed at noon on a Thursday. By 6 o'clock that evening, my phone looked like it was having a nervous breakdown. Calls, voicemails, text messages, unknown numbers, angry residents, confused residents, contractors stuck outside the subdivision, delivery drivers trying to figure out alternate routes. One resident actually left me a voicemail accusing me of holding the neighborhood hostage. I laughed when I heard that, because for 9 years nobody complained about free access. Apparently, the hostage situation only began when the owner of the property started acting like the owner of the property. Melissa called repeatedly. I ignored every call until my attorney advised me to answer one. The moment I picked up, she exploded. "You can't do this," she shouted. I remember looking out my kitchen window at the gate while she yelled and thinking how strange it was that people always discover respect after losing something they took for granted. I asked one question. "Melissa, who owns that road?" Silence. Then more yelling. She never answered, because she couldn't. A few days later, their attorney sent a letter threatening legal action. My attorney responded with a demand package outlining 9 years of unauthorized usage, maintenance impacts, liability exposure, and potential damages exceeding $2 million. Suddenly, the threats slowed down. Suddenly, nobody seemed eager to see a courtroom anymore. But then something happened that nobody expected. About 3 weeks after the gate went up, a kitchen fire broke out at a home on Birch Hollow Drive. It started small. An electrical appliance malfunctioned and ignited cabinets near the stove. Under normal circumstances, the local fire department would have used my access road and reached the scene within minutes. But the gate was closed. The trucks had to take the long route around the subdivision. By the time firefighters arrived, the situation had changed dramatically. What could have been a relatively contained incident had spread through multiple rooms. Smoke damage filled the structure. Portions of the roof suffered major damage. Nobody was seriously injured, thank God, but the financial consequences were enormous. The family included a young daughter who had to leave the home while repairs took place. Watching the story unfold on local news wasn't enjoyable. Contrary to what some people imagine, I wasn't sitting at home celebrating. I didn't want anyone's house to burn. I didn't want a child displaced. But I also knew something important. I wasn't the person who created that risk. The HOA had known the road was privately owned. They knew there was no easement. They knew emergency access depended entirely on my goodwill. Instead of securing a permanent agreement, they gambled that intimidation would work. That gamble failed. Once local reporters started investigating, the story exploded. They interviewed residents. They interviewed county officials. They reviewed property records. Then one station contacted me. I provided aerial drone footage showing exactly how much distance my road eliminated for emergency vehicles. Seeing it from above was shocking. The alternate route looked ridiculous. What should have been a short direct connection turned into a long winding detour. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. Residents began asking questions the HOA board didn't want to answer. Why wasn't an easement secured years ago? Why were emergency access documents incomplete? Why had nobody addressed such an obvious vulnerability? The pressure intensified. Then the lawsuit started. Families argued that the board's negligence had exposed the community to unnecessary risk. Insurance companies began conducting their own reviews. County officials launched inquiries. The fire marshal's office got involved. Every week seemed to bring another problem. Then came the revelation that completely changed the atmosphere inside the neighborhood. The home damaged by the fire belonged to Melissa's own daughter. Her granddaughter had been inside the house when the fire started. The moment residents learned that fact, the entire narrative shifted. People who had defended Melissa suddenly became very quiet, because now the consequences weren't theoretical anymore. Her own family had suffered from decisions she helped create. According to people who attended the emergency board meeting, the discussion was brutal. Residents demanded accountability. Board members argued with each other. Some blamed the fire. Others blamed the missing easement. Others blamed Melissa directly. Eventually a vote was called. 6 votes supported immediate removal. 1 vote opposed it. Just like that, the most powerful person in the HOA lost her position. 48 hours later, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Melissa. It was the newly appointed board president. His tone was completely different. No demands, no threats, no lectures about aesthetics. Just one simple question. Mr. Keller, what would it take to solve this? I told him exactly what I wanted. Respect, accountability, and a legally enforceable agreement. Negotiations lasted several weeks. Unlike the previous administration, the new board actually listened. They reviewed the documents. They acknowledged the mistakes. They understood the community needed permanent access and that I was under no obligation to provide it for free. Eventually, we reached an agreement. The HOA would receive a 10-year easement allowing continued use of the road. In exchange, they would pay a substantial monthly fee. They would reimburse my legal expenses. They would assume responsibility for specific maintenance obligations. And they would agree to strict enforcement clauses. Miss a payment? Access suspended. Damage my property? Financial penalties. Remove safety signage? Immediate termination provisions. Every detail was documented. Every responsibility was defined. Every assumption that had caused problems in the past was replaced with actual contractual language. The day the agreement was signed felt surprisingly calm. No dramatic speeches. No victory celebration. Just signatures on paper and a problem finally resolved the right way. A few weeks later, new safety signs appeared along the road. Not one sign, 3 signs, larger than the original, professionally installed, maintained at HOA expense. The same organization that once claimed the sign harmed community appearance was now paying to keep multiple signs standing. And perhaps the most ironic part of all was that nobody objected anymore. Suddenly, child safety and neighborhood aesthetics seemed perfectly compatible after all. Looking back now, people always ask me the same question. They want to know whether I regret closing the road. It's a fair question because once the story spread online, opinions landed all over the place. Some people said I should have kept allowing access no matter what happened. Others said I should have locked the gate years earlier. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. What I regret is that the situation ever reached that point in the first place. For nearly a decade, there was peace. No lawsuits, no arguments, no lawyers sending letters back and forth. All it would have taken to preserve that peace was a little common sense and a little respect. That's the part that still amazes me. Nobody was fighting over money in the beginning. Nobody was demanding compensation. Nobody was threatening anybody. The entire conflict started because someone decided control was more important than cooperation. That's something I've noticed more and more as I've gotten older. Some people become so focused on proving they have authority that they stop asking whether they should be using that authority in the first place. They stop seeing neighbors and start seeing obstacles. They stop solving problems and start creating them. And once ego enters the picture, logic usually leaves through the nearest exit. From a legal perspective, this entire mess was avoidable. A simple easement agreement could have been negotiated years earlier. The HOA could have protected emergency access. I could have been compensated fairly. The community could have avoided uncertainty. Instead, everybody operated on assumptions. The board assumed access would always exist. Residents assumed somebody else had handled paperwork. Melissa assumed intimidation would produce compliance. Every one of those assumptions eventually collapsed under reality. According to standard procedure, property rights don't disappear because they're inconvenient. Ownership doesn't become negotiable simply because a large group benefits from ignoring it. That's one of the biggest misconceptions people have when they watch stories like this. They see a neighborhood, a board, a committee, or an organization, and they assume size automatically creates authority. It doesn't. Documents create authority. Agreements create authority. Laws create authority. Wishful thinking doesn't. This is a psychological trap that affects individuals, businesses, governments, and communities alike. When people receive a benefit long enough, they stop remembering how they got it. Gratitude slowly transforms into expectation. Expectation transforms into entitlement. Entitlement transforms into resentment the moment the benefit disappears. That's exactly what happened here. For years, everyone appreciated the shortcut. Eventually, they started acting as though the shortcut belonged to them. The moment that belief took hold, conflict became almost inevitable. The lesson here is not that every HOA is bad. I've known good HOA boards that protect property values, maintain common areas, and solve problems responsibly. The lesson here is also not that every property owner should respond aggressively to conflict. The real lesson is that respect works both ways. If you're benefiting from someone else's cooperation, don't mistake that cooperation for surrender. If someone is extending goodwill, don't assume that goodwill has no limits. And if you're in a position of authority, never forget that authority is strongest when it's exercised with humility instead of ego. As for Melissa, I don't spend much time thinking about her anymore. Life moves on. People make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes become expensive lessons. Sometimes those lessons arrive publicly. But in the end, she wasn't the only person who learned something from this situation. The board learned. The residents learned. Even I learned. I learned that clear boundaries are often healthier than endless accommodation. I learned that documentation matters more than verbal understandings. Most importantly, I learned that protecting your rights doesn't make you unreasonable. Sometimes it simply makes you responsible. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had spent years allowing free access to your property and someone removed a safety sign meant to protect your grandchildren, would you have closed the gate? Do you think the HOA got exactly what it deserved? Or do you think things went too far once the consequences started affecting the entire community? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. And honestly, that's what makes the conversation so interesting.